Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our first ever Defense Priorities book talk. My name is Scott Sturgisic. I'm a researcher here at Defense Priorities, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Professor Brian Blankenship to discuss his most recent book called The Burden Sharing Dilemma, Coercive Diplomacy in U.S. Alliance Politics, published with Cornell University Press in 2023. Professor Blankenship is a non-resident fellow with us here at Defense Priorities. He's also an assistant professor of political science at the University of Miami, where he's been teaching since 2019. He received his PhD from Columbia University and has previously held positions at Dartmouth College and the Council on Foreign Relations. His research, as we'll see, focuses on alliance politics, US foreign policy, international security, and international cooperation. He's also published an explainer with us, our defense priorities, on burden sharing, published that back in January, and we'll link to that in the description of this video. Professor Blankenship, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm really grateful for your time and your willingness to talk about your book, The Burden Sharing Dilemma. The book was published a couple of years ago now, but over the past few years, we've seen the world, the international landscape change in some dramatic ways that maybe not all of us are used to, given the world in which we grew up, right? We've seen a reemergence of war on the European continent. We've seen a rise of a new great power rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. So alliance politics have been reemerging in relevance in US policy in a way that it maybe hasn't been since the Cold War. But one of the reasons we wanted to talk with you today is because as I'm sure you've noticed, the problem of burden sharing has become doubly important under this new administration. The Trump White House has made no secret of its intention to push more of the defense burden onto our allies, especially in Europe. And your book attempts to outline the conditions under which burden sharing like that is successful or not. So I think it has a lot to tell us about this current moment in international politics and the current administration's ambitions. But before we go any deeper, you're an academic, so you know better than anyone, definitions come first. So why don't you, if you could, give us your own brief definition of what burden sharing actually is in the context of alliance politics, and why is it a dilemma?
Sure, and thank you, Scott. I'm really happy to be joining you. Looking forward to this conversation. I think it's a useful question to start up front with, in part because it is so important, but it's deceptively simple, right? We kind of have a sense of burden sharing, in terms of contributing to an alliance, right? But what does that actually mean? And part of the reason it's tricky is that contributions can take any number of forms, right? Contribution to the alliance could be, in some cases, hosting a base. In some cases, it could be contributing forces to an ongoing conflict. In other cases, it could even be things like foreign aid. There's different tasks that an alliance can pursue, and in the broadest possible sense, burden sharing could take any number of forms depending on what the alliance is trying to do. Now, that being said, I think the kind of classic form of burden sharing, and the one that I focus on in the book, is effectively a contribution to the alliance's capacity for deterrence and defense, right? So a contribution to the alliance's overall ability to marshal enough military power if the time comes to deter conflict from happening and win the conflict if it does happen. And in particular, what I focus on primarily in the book, and I would say what's received the lion's share of the attention, has been defense spending, right? Kind of efforts on the part of allies to invest in their own defense, invest in collective capabilities so that they can actually make a contribution if the war comes. And to what I argue in the book is that, and the reason it's called the burden sharing dilemma, is that it's really this particular form of burden sharing, right? This burden sharing in the form of investment in self-defense that poses what I call the burden sharing dilemma. And the burden sharing dilemma is this. To put it very shortly, states in alliances face a trade-off between control and cost sharing. Because burden sharing isn't the only goal that states in alliances want, right? Burden sharing is important. It's arguably, in some cases, the most important objective in a military alliance, but it's not the only one, right? Countries also often want other kinds of concessions from their partners, right? They want the ability to shape the foreign policies, in some cases domestic policies, but mainly foreign policies of their allies. So, and this is especially true in the case of the U.S., right? Which, by virtue of it being so much larger, so much stronger than any of its partners, what does the U.S. want from its allies? Well, in part, what it wants is burden sharing so that it can help deter third-party adversaries. But the U.S. is unique in the sense that the U.S. isn't looking to its allies to help defend the U.S. Right? The U.S. is not anticipating an invasion of the U.S. from which it will benefit from an allied intervention. And so, what the U.S. often wants instead is allies to kind of more broadly align their foreign policies with its own. Right? And that could be anything from, again, hosting its bases to deploying forces to its military interventions, to making trade concessions to it, to refraining from pursuing nuclear weapons. Right? There's all kinds of objectives that the U.S. wants from its allies, or it's all kinds of concessions it wants from its allies. And the challenge is that burden sharing makes those other objectives harder. Right? To the extent that allies are capable of self-defense, they're capable of saying no to the U.S. Right? They're capable of refusing to make concessions to the U.S. because they're less dependent upon it. And the U.S. knows this. And so the U.S. is often less willing than one might think to really lean very heavily on its allies for defense burden sharing. And that's what I call in the book the burden sharing dilemma.
And given that this is such a dilemma, how do you grapple with that in the book? What's the central argument and framework that you put forward for describing the conditions under which burden sharing might be more propitious or less?
So what I argue in the book is that the U.S. sort of tailors its efforts to pursue burden sharing based on this trade-off between control and cost sharing. And in particular, in effect, what the U.S. does typically is it pursues burden sharing more in cases where the possibility of losing control over allies is less, and when its need for burden sharing is more. Right. So I'll start with the latter. So basically, the U.S. is more likely to pursue burden sharing to the extent that it faces constraints on its resources. Right. So those could be domestic political constraints. Right. It could be pressure from Congress, entanglement, skeptical public opinion. Right. But it could also be material constraints. Right. The U.S. is fighting a foreign war already, and it simply can't do two at once, and so it leans more on its allies to kind of help fill the gap. Right. This was the story of much of the 1970s, for example. The U.S. facing the Vietnam War, facing domestic pressure, facing also stagflation, just leaned a lot more on its allies to invest in defense so that the U.S. could kind of prioritize a bit more. On the other hand, the U.S. is less likely to pursue burden sharing from allies that are sort of paradoxically, the U.S. is actually less likely to pursue burden sharing from the allies who, in theory, could do it the most, right? So what I argue in the book is that there's this sort of, if you imagine like an upside down U, that and and on the x-axis being from weak allies to strong allies, and what I argue in the book is that the U.S. is actually more likely to pursue burden sharing from these sort of like allies in the middle, right? Your sort of moderate-sized allies who are big enough to contribute, but not so big that if they really kind of fully rearmed, that they would actually be fully independent from the U.S., right? So during the Cold War, say this was a South Korea, for example. Today it could be like a Poland. And it is often hesitant to seek burden sharing from allies that really could become independent. So during the Cold War, West Germany or Japan, in the post-Cold War environment, in some ways, I think the EU has sort of assumed this role. The US has often been kind of ambivalent about European burden sharing, often seeing efforts by the EU to really get serious on defense as a threat to NATO, and has at times really kind of tried to put really try to stamp out independent European efforts to create alternative structures to NATO. And in large part because I think it realized that a truly independent EU would be harder to control. And so the US is sensitive to kind of allies that are on the tail end of that distribution, right? The allies that are so potentially strong that their investments in defense would really allow them to kind of slip the bonds of kind of US influence.
Yeah, and given this this balancing act that alliance leaders need to play, you call them patrons, between the interests of control and cost sharing. I'm wondering how you outline the potential policy tools in their toolkit to affect burden sharing. What leverage do they have? What policy tools can they employ, generally speaking, to affect greater burden sharing, if that is their intention?
Yeah. So the tools that a patron, in this case the U.S., can use are they're pretty wide in number. They can include things like kind of call it normative pressure, right? So things like naming and shaming allies for failing to contribute, doing things like emphasizing like the common obligation to make a contribution to the alliance. Now, there's a lot of evidence this doesn't work. The U.S. has been, the U.S. has named and shamed its allies repeatedly, for as long as we've had these alliances. It doesn't really move the needle much, and there's some research to suggest to that effect as well. Another thing it can do is do things like establish or at least kind of help encourage the creation of alliance-wide targets, right? So NATO's 2% of GDP target is one such target, right? Can do things that, and this is different from naming and shaming in important ways, but do things that kind of create a common standard, a common target for the alliance, and kind of use that as a kind of focal point to shape burden sharing debates. There's some evidence that, for example, NATO's 2% pledge, which dates back to earlier, but really became a focal point in 2014. There's some evidence that kind of helped jumpstart things a little bit. targets. Now, it's hard to know, in part because Russia also annexed Crimea that year, so it's hard to know what was doing the work there. But I think there's some reason to think that the creation of these kinds of targets could be useful. Now, of course, there's downsides, right? The downside being that these numerical targets, they don't necessarily account for like what you're spending on. They don't account for. There's all kinds of creative accounting that partners can do to get over the 2%. Counting things that they weren't counting before as defense to kind of get their chin over the line a little bit. But on balance, there's some evidence that this can work. Now, the main tool set that I focus on in the book is the main tool set are kind of those that shape allies' incentives for burden sharing, right? Kind of more so than kind of shaping their perceived obligations, but that really shape kind of their incentives. And the number one tool in the toolkit the U.S. has here is leaning on allies' fears of abandonment. This ultimately is the final recourse that countries in alliances have as bargaining leverage. And this goes beyond burden sharing, but fundamentally, countries have bargaining leverage in alliances to the extent that they can threaten to walk away from the alliance unless their partner complies. And so, the main tool I focus on in the book is what I call conditional pressure, right? Which is to say that the U.S. can effectively threaten allies that if you don't burden share, right? If you don't boost defense spending, I will withdraw troops. I will limit the amount of assistance I send you in wartime. This can really span the gamut. Now, that's not the only tool. The U.S. can also, the U.S. could, in theory, just withdraw, right? Rather than lean on kind of threats and assurances, the U.S. can just say, "Hey, we're pulling out. You're on your own." And the U.S. does sometimes do that. Withdrew some of its forces from South Korea in the 1970s, from Japan in the 1970s, Germany in the 1960s, and there's some evidence that these had effects. Partly independent effects, partly also because they communicated to the allies that the U.S. was serious about actually, following through on its threats. There's a lot of evidence that allies really take this seriously when the U.S. does it in some cases, and crucially here is that this doesn't always necessarily require like total retrenchment, right? Like the U.S. doesn't have to divest from its alliances. The U.S. doesn't have to necessarily fully withdraw all of its troops. The U.S. is in some cases able to get away with kind of partial troop withdrawals coupled with threats that more will be coming unless the partner actually invests more in defense. And this is actually an area where Congress has historically played a kind of useful role. I tell in the book there's this pattern in the 1970s in particular where the Johnson-Nixon Ford administrations played this kind of good cop, bad cop routine with allies, right? Where effectively the message was, if you contribute, I can get Congress to back off. But if you don't contribute more, then we're going to have real problems with Congress trying to press for more troop withdrawals. And so, it's really, the form of pressure that ends up being, I argue, tends to be the most effective are those that kind of lean on this threat of abandonment, either in its kind of unconditional form of just saying, "Hey, we're out," or in saying, "Hey, we'd really love to stay in, but like you got to give us something, right? We got to have something we can take to Congress, and I think that's an area where Congress can actually play a really useful role is in kind of playing the bad cop.
Right. And on that that NATO target of 2%, I'm sure you've seen that is even subject to change now. Secretary Rubio announced, I think, a few days ago that he was now going to push for a 5% of GDP spending target for NATO. So we will see how that goes. But I on what you just said on the dynamic of the late 60s, early 70s, I wanted to turn to some of your historical case studies. They sort of form the meat of your non-theoretical portion of the book, and I found them really interesting. You had four. I wish we could dive into all of them deeply. They were all quite interesting to me, but in the interest of time, I wanted to hone in on a couple that might bear some significant relevance to us today. One is West Germany. You look at the period of 1961 to 74, and then another is South Korea from 1964 to 80. Both of these cases produced some success in U.S. burden sharing, but to different degrees, with different contours and implications. And naturally, I think they both have some bearing and implication on conversations around burden sharing in both of our, for lack of a better phrase, alliance spheres in Europe and in East Asia. So let's first dive into West Germany a little bit. When you discussed West Germany in the book, one of the things that stood out to me, which is something we've discussed at sort of a higher level up to now, is when in the early to mid 60s, under the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations, the U.S. policy generally aspired to burden sharing pretty consistently. But once that prospect became more likely in the latter half of the 60s and beyond, you noted that Washington started to actually get some fears of too much success. That this could actually go too far, and that West Germany could get too self-sufficient and too independent. I know that naturally, like the shadow of World War II still kind of loomed large in this period, and there were always sort of deep-seated fears of a rising Germany. This would reemerge during the reunification of Germany at the end of the Cold War. But I wanted to get your sense of what exactly about West Germany during this period, in the context of the Cold War and the international conditions of the time, gave rise to this fear in Washington that Germany would rearm too much, would become too independent, and how that tempered U.S. burden sharing ambitions toward West Germany.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think the change from the early 1950s through the late 1960s, I think is pretty important. And because I mean, there was a kind of background fear, even during as early as 1945. There was this background fear of kind of a return to German militarism. The kind of memory of World War II. Particularly among Germany's neighbors, but in the U.S. as well, and the U.S. tried to square the circle by basically encouraging the creation of a kind of of a truly integrated European military force, as early as the 1950, really, and leaned on very heavily by the Eisenhower administration. I mean, Eisenhower. There's a way in which Eisenhower was unique among post-war presidents, and maybe not unique, but he leaned very heavily toward the burden sharing and away from the control part of the trade-off, right? For Eisenhower, Eisenhower didn't quite see the trade-off between control and cost sharing the way that most of his successors did. Eisenhower basically wanted to let Europe rearm, and the U.S. would leave, and Europe would take care of itself. And even going as far as to have a pretty permissive structure of nuclear sharing, right? U.S. nuclear weapons were shared with the Allies and were nominally under U.S. control, but it would have been not too hard for the Allies to kind of take control in a crisis. And so, Eisenhower, much more permissive of nuclear proliferation, much less concerned about control over U.S. alliances than his successors were. And so I think to some extent the change over time, I think it's partly just a kind of personal difference, right, between Eisenhower and his successors. I think this is something that the theory, I think the theory focuses on kind of factors that we can kind of measure, that are kind of material factors. But I think we also can't ignore that there are going to be person-to-person differences in what presidents prioritize from these alliances. And Eisenhower definitely leaned more toward the cost-sharing side of the ledger. Now, I think the other thing that changed from the 1950s to 1960s was just the really rapid recovery of Europe. Because in the 1950s, Europe was still very much recovering from the war. It was still, the concern in the 1950s was still European weakness, and it was during the 1960s, to be sure, and it was throughout the Cold War. But particularly from Germany, the concern became just as much German strength as it was German weakness, particularly as Germany's post-war growth, really just continued at a very rapid pace. And it was imagined that if Germany was encouraged to rearm, that it would do so with nukes, that it would be hard to control. And I think also, this was recounted in great detail by Mark Trachtenberg in his famous book, A Constructed Peace in 1999. A big part of what really helped put the nail in the coffin of U.S. efforts to, U.S. efforts toward nuclear sharing, U.S. efforts to really devolve defense responsibility to Western Europe, was just the fear that the Soviets just wouldn't allow it. Right, there was a big fear that the Soviets would effectively conduct preventive war against West Germany to stop it from rearming. And this was, Trachtenberg argues that this was kind of at the heart of the Berlin crisis in the early 60s, the heart of the Cuban Missile Crisis as well, and that Kennedy was kind of forced to look down the barrel of just the reality that the Soviets weren't going to accept a rearmed Germany, and that that effectively U.S. policy became kind of with a tacit agreement with the Soviet Union that the U.S. would kind of maintain control of its bloc, and the Soviets would maintain control of their bloc, and they would kind of peacefully coexist. And that was kind of the beginnings of what what would eventually became full-fledged détente in the 1970s. But it really had its roots in the fear that the Soviets would effectively veto German rearmament. And when you combine that with pre-existing fears that the U.S. had about not being able to control Germany, German post-war recovery, the memory of World War II, and you you really had the U.S. kind of caught on the horns of this dilemma where it really wanted German contributions, and in some cases got them quite effectively. During much of the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Germany was basically the only country in Europe that the U.S. was able to get much of anything in the way of concessions on burden sharing from. Its trajectory was relatively positive in terms of burden sharing throughout the period, whereas in the rest of Europe, it kind of flatlined. And in large part, this was just because the U.S. had a lot of leverage over Germany, right? Germany was so exposed. In some ways, its position was akin to what, say, that of Poland's is today, if not even worse to some degree, because it was, the heart of the Warsaw Pact was just over the border, and so the U.S. kind of played it relatively safe, which isn't to say that it got nothing, right? It was able to get Germany to boost defense spending quite a bit, but it did so in a very cautious way. Again, kind of playing this good cop, bad cop routine with the Germans more so than what it did with, say, the South Koreans, where it really put the screws to them, and at various times actually contemplated total withdrawal.
Yeah, well, let's quickly turn to South Korea. That's probably the most successful case study that you outline in the book for burden sharing. During the period you examine, really toward the end of that period, I would say, South Korean defense spending as a percentage of GDP nearly quadrupled in about 5 years. That's pretty staggering. It perhaps reflects at least some of the ambitions of some of the more medium to large-ish size allies in Europe after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2020. This sudden jolt to look out for one's own defense. I want to look at the conditions of that, if we could, but also some of the consequences, which I think have some bearing on conversations in South Korea today. This was a success story to a degree, in that robust defense spending was embraced by South Korea, and the U.S. still was able to retain a decent degree of control. But one of the big flies in the ointment is nuclear weapons, right? The South Koreans at this time did attempt to pursue a nuclear program of their own, forcing the U.S. to rein them back in. We're having some of these same conversations today, and there's some notion that actually it's quite a palatable idea among certain elements of South Korean policymakers and thinkers. So I wanted to get your sense of, first of all, why this was a success, but also what the implications are of burden sharing for proliferation, right? Are the two intertwined? And if so, do they even have to be?
Yeah, I'll start with the kind of the general outlook on the South Korean case, and then I'll pivot to the question about nuclear weapons. What really made the South Korean case so effective, or made U.S. pressure on South Korea so effective, was that South Korea really was in this kind of sweet spot. Now, it wasn't initially, but during the 1950s, early 1960s, South Korea, the South Korean economy was still very small, right? Its per capita GDP was very low. It still relied very heavily on the U.S. for its defense, and not just kind of the direct U.S. presence, but also, the U.S. furnished enormous amounts of military aid to the South Koreans. It really, and economic aid as well. It really was kind of South Korea's lifeline. During this period, North Korea was actually the the larger, more powerful neighbor, what was the more powerful of the two Koreas. Of course, today, South Korea's population is bigger, its economy is way bigger, but during the 1950s, 1960s, it was the reverse. That started to change in the 1960s, and especially by the late 1970s, early 1980s. And South Korea was growing incredibly rapidly. It was rapidly beginning to kind of not quite approach middle income by, say, 1970, but it was on its way. It was on its way there if its growth rate continued that way. And in large part because of that, the U.S. started thinking that, well, South Korea is now in a position where actually can start looking out for itself a bit more, right? And this came at a very propitious time for the U.S. because this was the period of the so-called Nixon doctrine post-Vietnam, right? This sort of statement that Nixon made that became official, kind of official policy, that it would look to its allies, particularly those in East Asia, to kind of assume primary responsibility for their own defense. And here comes South Korea growing very quickly, and so the U.S. basically communicated to South Korea that we're going to look to you to do more. And so the U.S. pulled out the 7th Infantry Division from Korea. It contemplated pulling out more. There were periods of time where the Secretary of Defense was mulling over the idea of pulling out entirely and turning those forces into kind of like a mobile reserve that could be deployed anywhere else in the region, kind of in an emergency. But the message was very clearly communicated to the South Koreans that they needed to spend more and that future troop withdrawals were not off the table. And the South Koreans, took this very seriously. They really depended on the U.S. for their survival. They were facing a powerful North Korea. They were facing that was allied with the two communist giants, South of China and the Soviet Union. And so, they really underwent a very dramatic campaign of armament, massive military modernization, new taxes levied for defense, enlisted more folks into the military. Right? This was a really, really massive rearmament campaign, and achieved a lot of success. As you said, the South Korean military spending just absolutely skyrocketed in the 1970s, at the same time that U.S. military aid really dropped quite precipitously. And by 1980, the South Koreans were furnishing, virtually all of the cost of their own defense, and spending way more than they had in, both in absolute terms and relative to GDP than they had before. And so, in many ways, South Korea kind of checked all the boxes, right? It was a high threat. It was a moderately sized ally. And it really faced a credible, compelling U.S. threat of abandonment. No, as you said, though, that the nuclear weapons issue kind of put a damper on this to some extent. Not entirely, but because the U.S. was still able to really pressure South Korea to spend more on defense. But what South Korea's nuclear push did, in part, was it made it harder for the U.S. to execute a total withdrawal, despite what the Nixon and Ford administrations had mused about, and also notably despite what Jimmy Carter had campaigned on. Carter campaigned in '76 in part on withdrawing U.S. forces from South Korea, and he was really serious about this. He really actually tried quite hard during his presidency to make it happen. But a variety of factors conspired against this. One was that it encountered a lot of opposition domestically, both from within his administration, also from Congress. In part because in part because of the nuclear issue, right? In part because there was, some concern that, look, if you want to prevent South Korea from trying to go nuclear, having a U.S. presence there as leverage is one of the best levers you have. And also in part because there was some disagreement about North Korean capabilities, and ultimately, Carter lost that fight. It wasn't entirely explained by the fear of South Korean nuclearization, but it was at least in part of that. And I think that that, and to a large extent, that has been the story of U.S. alliances. I mean, really ever since, right? I mean, in large part because the U.S. has placed such a high premium on stopping proliferation, that has made the U.S. not less willing to lean heavily on burden sharing, though to some extent, but it's made it hard for the U.S. to actually credibly threaten total withdrawal than it would be otherwise. And that poses challenges, right? Because if you're a U.S. ally and that the U.S. cares about proliferation, then that having the ability to proliferate is in a lot of ways like your best card you can play, right? It is the kind of ultimate hedge you have, not only against being abandoned, but also if U.S. does abandon you, then you have that is a way of, if you can do it quickly, then that is a way of securing yourself without the U.S. And so there's heavy incentive for American allies to kind of have the nuclear card in their back pocket. Now, not all of them do. South Korea does. Japan does. Somewhat. There's some evidence that Poland wants a NATO nuclear sharing today. It is really starting to get in the nuclear energy game. Germany, somewhat, sort of the other end of the spectrum, seems to be getting out of the nuclear game, which I think has interesting implications for kind of the German nuclear debate. Now, in principle, like it could relaunch its energy program. It could get foreign assistance, but it does make it harder for it to play that card than if it had a really advanced indigenous program, energy program, like say the South Koreans or the Japanese do. But it poses a lot of challenges, and it undermines the U.S.'s kind of major trump card on burden sharing, which is the threat of abandonment. Now, it doesn't mean it can't use it. The U.S. can still say, look, we will abandon you unless you spend more on defense, and allies can still take that seriously, right? It's not a 0-1-0-100 proposition, right? What makes an abandonment threat effective is not the certainty with which it'll be carried out. It's that there's some probability that will be carried out. But the nuclear issue kind of reduces that probability more than it would have been otherwise.
Yeah, I think that leads us pretty cleanly into how I wanted to spend the remaining time we have, which is returning to the present. As I said in the beginning, alliance politics are back with a vengeance. I think your book has perhaps more to say than most about understanding how burden sharing under a Trump administration, under future administrations, may or may not play out. I wanted to look at a couple things, if we could, in today's landscape. One thing that stuck out to me in your book was the implications of a specific condition for burden sharing that you outline, which is a shared external threat environment. the patron or the alliance leader and its allies both having, broadly speaking, a shared understanding of who and what the threat is and the nature of that external threat. And that jumped out to me because I'm thinking about the modern landscape of international politics. And I'm thinking about how mismatched a lot of threat perceptions actually are between us and our allies. You say in the book, you characterize it as a balance between patron and ally perceptions of the threat. Seems to me that there isn't a balance with maybe two of the bigger challenges, or maybe biggest, strategic challenges that the US faces today in Russia and China. I think both Europe and the US view China as something of a strategic challenge, but I think the US views China in much more of a threatening light than our European allies do. The converse is true for Russia, but at least right now. The Trump administration doesn't seem to view Putin's Russia as much of a threat, as acute a threat as our European allies do. And that has a lot of complicated implications for the prospects for burden sharing. So I hope you could talk a little bit about that, how this mismatch in threat perceptions between us and our allies has some kind of bearing on the prospects for future burden sharing.
Yeah. So in general, in alliances, because bargaining leverage depends so heavily on kind of your threat to or your partner's expectation that you might kind of walk away from the partnership. And the converse is true too, right? Your partner's leverage depends in part on how much you think that they might be willing to walk away. Kind of that an imbalance of threat perception has big implications for bargaining. It also is, which in turn means it has big implications for burden sharing, right? So in the case of Europe, to the extent that European partners view Russia as more of a threat than the U.S., that in principle gives the U.S. quite a bit of leverage on burden sharing, right? The U.S. can effectively, and also I think puts the onus more on Europe to actually burden share, right? I mean, part of the challenge during the Cold War was that the threat from the Soviet Union was so overwhelming, at least for parts of it, that it was felt so intensely by both the U.S. and by its European partners, right? And so there's a kind of ironic way in which because the threat was felt maybe not equally, but it was felt intensely on both sides of the Atlantic, that it undermined U.S. bargaining leverage, right? It effectively equalized the bargaining leverage because Europe really needed the U.S., but Europe also knew that the U.S. to some extent didn't want the Soviets to dominate Europe. And so, the U.S. threat of exit was, it was not zero, right? Again, the U.S. was able to leverage this threat quite a bit, but it was lower. It was estimated to be lower than it would have been if the U.S. had, seen the Soviets as not a threat at all. And so, fast forward to today, and in principle, this means that Europe is more likely to kind of actually burden share in a way that it didn't during the Cold War, despite Russia not arguably, being less of a threat than the Soviets were during the Cold War, right? Just a much smaller actor in world politics than the Soviet Union was. And now that the devil's in the details a little bit, because in large part because NATO is such a big alliance that the threat is not felt equally across Europe. And of course, this was during the Cold War too, right? It was not an accident that West Germany was the most responsive to, in terms of burden sharing than, say, Spain and Portugal, or I guess Portugal and Italy, say. And and that's true today as well, right? If you are Poland, if you're the Baltics, if you're Romania, if you're Finland, you feel the threat much more acutely than if you are Spain, Portugal, Italy, say, or for that matter, France and Germany. And that has implications for burden sharing, right? And you have seen a kind of bifurcation in Europe between Eastern flank countries and everybody else on defense spending, right? The Poles, really leading the charge on defense, and Germany and France and Britain have, indicated that they also take Russia really, really seriously, but making the painful budgetary trade-offs to actually spend more on defense at the expense of other things is another matter entirely, right? Despite all the talk of a turning point in German foreign policy, for example, Germany was able to kind of eke out 2% last year, but it's unclear how sustainable that is, in part because Germany has, Poland separates Germany from Russia, and so it's much easier for Germany to kind of pass the buck than it is for the Eastern flank countries, and this is a challenge for NATO today in a way that it wasn't during the Cold War, in part because NATO is so much bigger than it was during the Cold War, so that now the Eastern flank is a lot of NATO's smaller to medium-sized members, and its larger members are comparatively more insulated. Whereas during the Cold War, the Eastern flank was Germany, and which was NATO's largest member outside the U.S. And so, there's a kind of mismatch between the allies who could contribute the most in Europe and the allies who perceive the threat the most. And, that has, and I think it will likely continue to pose challenges for like a truly holistic European approach to, to defense burden sharing, because, you have these geographic differences that are just really hard to overcome. Now they could change, right? I have little doubt that if Russia invaded Poland, then I think you'd see real change in Germany. But maybe if the U.S. left NATO, you'd see big change in Germany. But still, the temptation to kind of pass the buck is very strong, right? There's always, you can always tell yourself a story about how you can wait. The threat isn't that serious yet. Unless the threat is actually on your doorstep, it is very easy to ignore. And that is what I fear might continue to be the case in Western Europe, even as the U.S. Puts pressure and contemplates a diminished role in Europe. Is that it will take a lot for Western Europe to see the urgency in the same way that the Eastern flank countries do, and that poses challenge for U.S. prioritization, right? If the U.S. wants to focus on East Asia, then it would be helpful for the U.S. to do that if Europe kind of stepped in and filled the gap. But if it's only the Eastern flank countries doing so, then the U.S. kind of faced with a choice of, do we withdraw in the hope that the Eastern flank countries can manage it on their own, or not? And that's a difficult choice, and it's not and it's not obvious to me what the Western European response would be, because I think concern is one thing, but actually putting budget to paper is another thing entirely.
Yeah, absolutely. With our last 5 minutes here, I wanted to sort of end on a big picture question, that may or may not be too big for 5 minutes, but we'll give it a try. For me, one of the important 30,000 foot takeaways from your book was that policy never exists in a vacuum. You make it clear in the book that regardless of the intentions of policymakers, regardless of the tools they have at their disposal, oftentimes it's the international conditions that dictate things. Usually the international conditions that you lay out in your book need to be ripe for burden sharing to see some real success, if that is the intention, the intended policy and policy outcome. So at least when it comes to burden sharing, are policymakers just totally at the mercy of the conditions of the international landscape? How much agency do they really end up having at the end of the day?
Yeah, I sometimes call this the Mick Jagger principle of burden sharing, which is that the U.S. can't always get what it wants, but sometimes gets what it needs. But no, I think that's a real challenge. In some ways, the optimistic message of the book is that when the U.S. needs burden sharing the most, it's often able to get it, right? It's able to get it when the threat environment is high, when resources are constrained, that's when it needs it the most. Of course, the flip side of the argument is that it's often hard to get more burden sharing outside the context of a crisis type situation, right? And you could consider, I think you could consider the late 1960s, early 1970s kind of a crisis point for U.S. alliances, right? Under a lot of strain from the Vietnam War, from stagflation, from Congress, and the upside was that the crisis created the opportunity for burden sharing, but the downside was that you would have liked to be able to do that without a crisis. And ideally, we'd like to change policy before we absolutely have to. Now, that being said, to a large extent, it depends on what you value, right? And I used the example of Eisenhower earlier, who was, I think, a president who kind of uniquely was relatively not unconcerned, but relatively less concerned with kind of the intricacies of alliance control, right? He still saw U.S. alliances in Western Europe and East Asia as fundamentally kind of pacts between, especially with NATO, as a kind of pact between actors that could be kind of equals in sharing the burden, right? He wanted Europe to be kind of a third force in the world that could take care of itself and kind of act in its own interest. And that has decidedly not been the perspective of many presidents since, many policymakers since, who think of what Madeleine Albright called the 3Ds, right? When in contemplating European defense initiatives, she argued that the U.S. must avoid what she called the 3Ds, that Europe should not duplicate what NATO does, it should not decouple from NATO, and its defense procurement should not discriminate against non-EU defense firms. And, it's hard to get further away from Eisenhower than that, right? That's very explicitly a case that the EU should not, in fact, be an independent actor, right? And that the EU should not do anything that would get itself away from NATO. And that to some extent is a policy choice, right? The U.S. And all these are policy choices. I think the book makes the case that there are reasons that the U.S. sometimes feels nudged in one direction or another. But I mean, the big assumption underlying the whole book is that the U.S. sees something of value in these alliances and wants to keep them and wants some amount of both control and cost sharing. But if you don't want control, right? If you take a very optimistic view of proliferation, right? If you're a nuclear optimist, like say a Ken Waltz, then the logic of alliances as tools of non-proliferation diminishes, and and your need for control diminishes, and so to a large extent, all these are policy choices, right? All these are this is a trade-off that exists in reality, but people differ over where they land on this trade-off, right? People who advocate for foreign policy or grand strategy of restraint, for example, tend to really emphasize burden sharing over alliance control, right? And that's a policy preference, right? It's not an iron law that the U.S. has to value both or has to value one more than the other, right? Individual people are going to differ over which end of the trade-off they value more, which end of the trade-off they fear more, and so none of this is inevitable, right? I think there are ways in which structural factors nudge policymakers, but ultimately, they can never be fully determinative, and a lot is going to depend on just what people think U.S. foreign policy should be, what people think alliances are for, and there's inevitably going to be differences across individuals on that, right? These are all fundamentally policy choices.
Right. Great. Well, we are just at time. I wanted to again thank Professor Brian Blankenship for his time joining us today to discuss his very topical study. If you all are interested in getting more content like this from Defense Priorities, you can always follow us on Twitter, keep following this YouTube channel, and of course, please do visit our website. You can also check out Professor Blankenship's Defense Priorities Explainer, which I mentioned earlier in the call that he wrote at the beginning of the year. We'll have the link to that in the description as well. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone.